Well, we will slog through stuff that's not, I don't want to say not radio related, because it is, but it's not the fun part. It's not the, you know, picking up the microphone and talking, or picking up the soldering iron and building something. We're going to talk about picking up a mic and what you, whoop, that isn't working. Why not? But who you can talk to and what you have to do to make sure you're doing things correctly. And we're going to start that with talking about control operators, station ID, and third-party communications. Yes, we are in the rules here, by the way. So you see here a definition of control op. Let me make sure I'm in the right place here, that I started. Zip over here real quick. Yep, we're in the right spot. Good deal. So there are, when you pass your test, you will be issued a license from the Federal Communications Commission. You already know that. And that grants you certain privileges and also certain responsibilities. And one of those is to ensure that you are operating within the scope of your license class, and that you actually, that which makes you a, if you are operating, that makes you the control operator. And the important part of that is that also makes you responsible for making sure that everything you're doing complies with the rules. Let's see, still can't get this. There we go. So your license will grant you certain privileges, and some of those privileges are to use equipment. And therefore, again, you have to operate within the authorization of your license. That means on the correct frequencies that you're authorized for, in certain modes, and within your privileges. You have to be present at the control point of the station. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to be where the transmitter is, but it means that you actually have to be physically present at the control point of wherever you're controlling it from. So we talked about a station licensee. You saw that here just a second ago. You know, the control operator has to be designated by the station licensee, and that's assumed to be one and the same, unless otherwise documented somehow. Again, you don't have to be where the physical transmitter is. You may be controlling a repeater, and we won't be at the location where the repeater is because it's in a locked gate, in a locked building. But you have to be able to assert some sort of control of that. So again, it can be either at the transmitter. If I were to take the background off and turn my camera around, you'd see a really messy room. So I probably won't do that. But just to my right is my HF rig. I'm physically here at the transmitter. Just to my left is a couple of 2-meter rigs and 70-centimeter rigs. Again, I'm physically controlling those at the point of the transmitter. But you don't have to be, because my one radio, actually 2 of my radios, in theory, if I have the right things set up on them, I can control them from my phone via a link and a circuit and the internet, wherever I'm at. And I can use my phone to control my rig right over here. Can I make that work right now? No. Tried, but still working on it. Work in progress. But again, the important point here is that your control point either can be at the physical side of the transmitter or it can be some sort of remote thing, but you have to be able to control what you're doing. This all comes into play in a couple of different ways. Normally you're thinking, well, gee, this all makes sense. I'm the control operator because I am picking it, well, you can't see it, picking up a microphone and transmitting. You know, this is connected directly to my radio over here. But there are times that you may be have somebody with you that's not licensed, or maybe they don't have the same class of license that you do. Can they operate your equipment? Sure, as long as you're there. We see this a lot on amateur radio field day, where we may have brand new technicians. We may have people that aren't licensed yet, that are working on their license, or maybe have seen the operation and drop by and go, hey, this looks pretty interesting. We can hand them the microphone and allow them to make transmissions as long as one of us is there and operating within the scope of our own license.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
If you have somebody that's not licensed, are they responsible for going through and giving out, I guess, your call sign in place while they're on? Is that how that works?
You can do it that way, or what you might do, you know, if we were at field day, we would probably, you know, actually call somebody ourselves, you know, and make connection, and then, hey, I want to, you know, I want to introduce you to Billy, who's a Boy Scout here, who's walked by, who's interested in radio. You want to talk to Billy? Sure, but probably I've started the conversation. I may probably will end it, and somewhere in there, I will give my ID.
Yeah, and you'd still have to get back on there in 10 minutes to give your ID again. Is that correct?
That's correct, and we'll talk about that here in just a little bit too.
Okay, well, thanks.
So field day is a great way where you have guest operations. It may be that you have a friend over at your house and say, hey, watch this. This is pretty cool. And, you know, I had a friend do that to me years ago. I wasn't licensed at the time, and he was trying to interest me. He goes, here, let's talk, see if we can talk to Australia today. That's pretty cool. And, you know, he dialed around and found, I don't think we ever talked to Australia, but he found somebody ways off to talk to and established it, and then handed me the mic. And I talked for a minute, and I go, okay, I'm going to hand the mic back to Peter. And he finished it up. Again, I was operating within his license privileges under his call sign, and he was solely responsible for whatever I did. So if I had started doing things that were against the regulations, he would have immediately stopped me and goes, you can't do that. You have to let me have the mic. Let's see here. Gee, we talked about station ID. The deal is every transmission has to be identified somehow. Stating your call sign every 10 minutes and whenever you finish. You are not legally required to use phonetics on voice modes. It's good practice, depending on what voice mode you're using. If you're on the 2-meter repeater, sometimes you hear phonetics, most of the times you don't. You can see my call here. My call is WX5MOR. You will very rarely hear me use that on a local repeater. If you hear me on HF, which is within my general class privileges, you'll hear Whiskey X-Ray 5 Mike Oscar Romeo. I'm using phonetics there. Uh, Phonetics is a best practice. It solves issues of if you're a police dispatcher or fire dispatcher in Oklahoma City, you know that you have a street named Ross, R-O-S-S. You also have a street named Roff, R-O-F-F. Ross and Roff sound very similar, particularly if you're in a hurry or speaking fast, and you will hear them go, your call is at 1029 South Ross, R.O. Sam Sam, again using phonetics, or whatever address on Roff, R.O. Frank Frank. Sorry. You notice my phonetics were a little different maybe on that last one that you may have studied. There are more than one alphabet. In fact, there's several. Typically, amateur radio uses the international phonetic alphabet. I lapsed into dispatcher speak. I'm sorry, I did that for many years. And when I get into dispatcher mode, I revert back to the police and fire alphabets. You'll also hear people use non-standard phonetics, particularly during some contests, and that's just bad juju. I'll just put it out there. I'm sure I've done it before. I'm sure other people on this call have done it before. But use the proper phonetics. K is not kilowatt. And by the way, don't make them up, because then you start doing things like using Xerox with a Z, which of course it doesn't start with. U for Yukon, which does not compute either unless you're talking about the college. So use the proper phonetics. Enough of that. Can you use tactical calls? What is a tactical call? Well, as Lee mentioned a while ago, I'm the emergency management director at the City of Moore. My radio call on my public safety radio is Moore EM1. Can I use Moore EM1 on the ham bands? Sure. Do it all the time. Well, I'll do it once in a while. That is not your station identification. It may be that in my public safety world, if you're supporting some sort of disaster operation, you may be assigned to use an amateur radio at a hospital or a staging area or a logistics area. And in those cases, you would probably use a tactical call to call each other. EOC, this is logistics. Logistics, this is more hospital. That way, we don't have to remember, okay, KC5FM is at the hospital and N50U is at somewhere else, and so on. We can call more hospital. This is more EOC, and I don't have to remember who's actually there and what their call sign is, because it may very well likely be somebody I don't even know. However, once again, all transmissions have to be identified, and you have to give your FCC issued license call sign every 10 minutes and when you're done. So when signing off, I may, this is more EOC WX5MOR. Given my tactical, given my FCC mandated. So again, tactical calls are fine. We might be out on a bike race type ride. The SCARS Club has supported Bike MS for several years. And there may be 3 or 4 people out talking to each other, and it may get, and we may be on direct, which means we're not going through a repeater. And we may just call, hey, Mark, this is Gayland. And then, Mark answers, Gayland, go ahead. Again, sometimes it's difficult maybe to associate names, call signs, so on. So you just use your tactical. Again, every 10 minutes, WX5MOR, and then when I'm done, WX5MOR. Does that make sense, everybody?
Yep.
Cool deal. We'll move right along. Repeaters also ID at the same 10-minute rule. They can be on voice or Morse code. If you listen to the 147.06 repeater that the club has, you'll hear it every once in a while. W5NOR. That's why. There are special rules for special things such as satellites and the International Space Station. Once in a while, you'll hear special event calls. There is I don't know if it's a contest as such, but there's the 12 days of amateur radio Christmas, and those have some special call signs. I believe it's W2A on the first day and W2B on the second day. You might hear there's an event generally in September where a number of amateur radio stations along the route of the old Highway 66 come on the air, and the goal is for everybody else to see how many of those stations they can talk to over a 10 or 15 day period. And they all have special call signs. They all have a W6 call sign. So the one in Santa Barbara, California may be W6A. The one here is W6M, I believe. And they just A, B, C, D along the entire route. Those are legal. They are assigned by the FCC. During field day, if you're operating the club station as part of field day, you will very likely be using the call sign of W5NOR, which is our club's call sign. Moving along, third-party communications, which can get kind of interesting if you communicate outside the US. Third-party communications means that you're making some sort of transmission on behalf of somebody else who's not a licensee, which means you may be speaking on the air, maybe you're passing a message to somebody. Again, there's two situations, one within the US and one that's not within the US. Within the US, there aren't any special rules. Just the same rules that would normally apply, no commercial, nothing commercial in nature, no music, that sort of thing. So it very well may be that a friend says, can you use your ham radio to contact and send a message to my brother who's in California? Sure, we can try. So I take down the message, send it on, perhaps to another ham radio operator. I'm making a transmission on behalf of somebody else. Birthday greetings are fine. Again, anything non-commercial in nature. When it gets tricky is when you're doing that internationally, because other countries have rules. Some of them allow it, some of them don't. Easiest way to do that is if you're going to make a message on behalf of somebody else, see what the rules are. See what the rules are for that particular country. Mark or Bill or Lee, do you have anything further on this? I've never done third-party communications outside the US. Anything I've missed on this one?
I cannot think of anything as far as out of country. The only thing that I was familiar with at all was Salvation Army during the Puerto Rico, and that was just passing vital information back and forth.
The big thing with third-party traffic is it's the countries you don't think are going to have a problem. Think of like a small country in Africa. They use their telephone systems to the revenue from foreign calls to pay for their local stuff. So it's the smaller countries. You know, it's not going to be Canada. It's going to be Tanzania or something like that. So those are kind of my go-to answers on that one.
Once again, you know, if you're going to be doing some of that, just check either at the ARRL website or FCC sources to make sure that you're within what you should be doing. Okay, any on the operating regulations, do we have any questions at this point?
Nope.
Well, do we need a break, or do you want to just keep right on going?
Keep going.
Very good. We'll move into the next module, which, as you can see very well, because you can read as well as I can, we're going to talk about interference, remote operation, and prohibited transmissions. We're going to start with a couple of abbreviations here. QRN, as in Nora or Nancy, is things you can't do much about. Static, thunderstorms, which generates electricity, which then can cause interference, particularly if you're on AM or some HF. Man-made, which might include appliances, power lines, all sorts of things of that nature. I actually was getting ready to transmit or work on the Route 66 on the air event a couple of years ago. Hadn't had my HF radio on in a while. Turned it on, and it did not matter where I was at. I had terrific static, terrible static. Let me put it that way. I hunted. I couldn't find it. Started turning things off in the house. Finally started flipping breakers, trying to see, because it obviously had to be something local. It turned out our freezer had locked up and was causing interference to all of my stuff. As soon as I turned it back on, apparently whatever was wrong with it fixed itself, and it's run fine forever since then. There also is what we call QRM, mic, which is other interference, perhaps from other transmissions, maybe internally within the radio. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's intentional. You know, it's harmful, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's intentional. I am an administrator for our city of our public safety radio system, which we work off of the state's system. Very sophisticated system. It's got 40 some towers statewide. They're all interconnected. You know, my police officers can go to Tulsa and still talk back off their handhelds back into our dispatch here. It's a wonderful system. Here for several months, we've been experiencing terrific interference on the system, and to the point where it's knocking it down where we couldn't hardly use it at times. Certainly disruptive. And we, as the slide says, we tried to deal with it, but my gosh, we couldn't. You know, it's our lifeline for the police and the fire departments. We finally, some smart engineers finally got on it and found that it was a bidirectional amplifier, which is a system that takes a weak signal inside of a building and puts it outside through a good antenna. Think hospitals. You go into a hospital, or if you go into my emergency operations center, it's a safe room bunker. Radio doesn't get in and out of it very well, but there are certain places you can put some antennas inside, hook into this BDA or bidirectional amplifier, which then puts it to an antenna outside, and then takes signals outside and puts them inside. Turns out Veterans Administration Hospital had one of those that had been installed about the same time we started having interference. Imagine that. And whoever installed it had the power way too high on it, given how close they were to our antennas on the public safety system. As soon as they found that, turned the power down, the interference went away. It was harmful, but not willful. Nobody did that intentionally. On the other hand, you will also find there is willful interference. It's illegal, but you still get it. There are amateur radio operators that occasionally will cause harmful interference willfully. It may be that they don't like the person they hear talking on the repeater, so they try and key up and fix it where the repeater won't work. In the law enforcement world, somebody may be trying to jam us so that we can't send our police officers somewhere. It is a legal issue. It's a law enforcement issue. Honestly, in the amateur radio world, unless it gets so severe that it causes multiple instances of multiple people unable to use a frequency, short of somebody knowing the person and talking them in person, and trying to work through the issue there. The FCC may get involved, but that's very rare. There is also amateur radio operators who have been deemed as official observers. Sometimes they can help with the issue. The good part, or the part of this that you need to understand, is don't be one of those people. I will say that a lot of times when there's somebody intentionally trying to mess the air up, it's best just to ignore them rather than hey, get off the air. Hey, we're trying. That just eggs it on. Ignoring it tends to be better because that way the guy doesn't get, or the girl, whoever, the person doesn't get the satisfaction of riling you up a little bit. Don't be the person that causes interference, whether it's willful or not. Easiest way, use common sense with your operating. Know how to operate your equipment. Know what generates interference. Remember that nobody in amateur radio owns a frequency. You will hear nets going on. Every Monday night at 8 o'clock, our club hosts a net on 6 meters. It's at 8 o'clock on 50.200. Every Tuesday night, we have an Aries net. Every Wednesday night, there's one on 10 meters. They all are on certain frequencies. We don't own those frequencies. If somebody else is talking, they have just as much right to that as we do. Established nets, particularly when you get up in the HF realm, you'll hear people that every night they're on a certain time, certain frequency. And it really makes them mad if you're talking, but they don't own the frequency any more than anybody else. Now, be a good neighbor. If there's a net on 3903 on Sundays at 8 a.m., then don't use 3903. listen around before you start talking. And then somebody may come on and say, hey, we understand you have the right to do this, but understand that we also typically have a net at this time on this frequency. If that's the case, most people will go, oh, I'm sorry, and they'll move off somewhere else. Also, please understand and recognize sometimes there's special circumstances. When hurricanes are forecast, there are some frequencies that are used by the National Hurricane Center to visit with and communicate with interests along the coasts, wherever that may be. And you'll see notices go out, hey, please avoid using, I don't know the frequencies off the top of my head, but 7.285, 14.300, because those are typically recognized. That's a special circumstance. Heaven forbid we have issues in Oklahoma. Our amateur radio emergency services people use certain frequencies. Understand that. The big deal is use courtesy, use common sense. If there's disaster operations going on, try and avoid that. One other place you may hear this, particularly as a technician, if you're using the 2-meter repeater of the club, that is also used during storms for storm spotting for the city of Norman. The storm spotters are amateur radio operators. They go out in the field, or they are at their homes watching the weather. And it may be that they are needing to contact either the Norman Emergency Operations Center or the National Weather Service and saying, we've got a tornado. I'm observing severe hail. I'm observing severe winds. Those messages need to get through. Yes, people tend to chat on the repeaters. But be a good neighbor, use some common sense, use some courtesy. If there's storm stuff going on, and you hear the net operators come on going, hey, this is net control for the Skywarn net or net control at Norman EOC, take your conversation somewhere else or wait a little while. Be a good neighbor. We're back to control points. Wow, you thought we'd gotten past that, didn't you? Again, you don't have to be at the physical transmitter. There's local control where you are. There's remote control where you're linked to it. That's pretty self-explanatory. Sometimes there's automatic control. No matter what, a control operator is always required, responsible for proper operation. Repeaters work under automatic control, but our people that are responsible for the repeaters have ways of getting in and shutting it down if there's an issue of some sort. But again, you're responsible for your transmissions through it. So just because somebody else has to have physical control of that repeater, if there's a problem, doesn't mean you can get on and do whatever you want. You're responsible for whatever you talk or do. Oh, we're going to get big and bad now. What you can't do. Number one, you can't have unidentified transmissions. If you're going to talk, you need to make sure that you use your call sign and identify your transmission. Goes right into not giving your call sign. You can't transmit false or deceptive signals. That's kind of the equivalent of yelling fire in a movie theater. Can't use somebody else's call sign. If you have yours, you use yours. Again, if you're operating under somebody else's privileges, you may say this is WX5MOR operating as a guest operator under KK5FM. who is a license class higher than mine. But you're identifying the transmission, and I'm not using, I'm not identifying myself as KK5FM. That's the key. Again, can't do false distress or emergency signals, fake calls for help, that sort of thing. Yeah, that's, shouldn't even have to say that. Obscene or indecent speech. Remember, these are public airwaves. The next one is, as it says, up to interpretation. Typically, try and avoid controversial subjects and things that aren't, let's talk about ham radio. Let's not talk about the in-depth issues with politics, in-depth conversations about body parts of a different gender, things of that nature. Just stay away. This is a fun hobby. Sometimes people forget that we do this for fun. It's a hobby. We don't have to do it. And a lot of times we want to visit with our friends about current events. And my gosh, over the last 6 months, that's been politics and all sorts of things related to politics. But again, let's keep things fun, and remember, just because you and your friend may share the same viewpoint, there's other people listening. I would normally have my radio on right here within reach of my hand. I don't now because I don't want it to interfere with what's going on here. But I have my radio on a lot that people never know that I'm around. I leave a radio on in my emergency operations center all the time. It may not be that I can hear it, but that doesn't mean that I don't wander through my office or through that office once in a while, and I can hear conversations that are going on. Nobody ever knows that I'm there. Just remember, the whole world may be listening. And there may be probably are people listening that aren't even hams. You don't have to have a license to listen. There are lots of phone apps now that people take scanners and pipe them over the internet. It used to be that if you wanted to listen to my police and fire conversations, you had to buy a scanner, a couple $100. A good one nowadays, quite a bit more than that. But you know what? You don't have to have that. All you have to have is a phone with the right app on it, and you can listen to our police and fire conversations. And in fact, we found out during the presidential visit to Tulsa last summer, which, as you will recall, there were lots of anti-political rabble-rousers. We'll just get right to it. That were in Tulsa, that were trying to disrupt the presidential visit. And there were lots of extra law enforcement, extra public safety people in Tulsa. And we found that the bad guys were listening to all of our police transmissions over their phone apps. And sometimes they would beat us to locations. Now, in the public safety world, we can deal with that through encryption, which is not legal on ham radio, as we'll get to here in a minute. But again, just remember, just because you think this is an amateur radio thing, Scannerland is listening, Public's listening. So again, avoid controversial subjects. This is supposed to be fun. Don't play DJ. Music is a prohibited transmission. Now, that's not to say that if I have a radio going in the background for my own personal hearing, I'm talking about a music radio, that I have to shut it off. It's just that I can't go, hey, Lee, I heard this really cool song the other day that you're gonna know, and then play it over the air. That's no. You can't play music. You can't intentionally play music over the air. Again, if you're in the hospital and transmitting and they've got music on in the background, that's, you're not intentionally trying to broadcast music over the amateur radio frequencies. It just happens to be there as a background thing. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. What else? Oh my gosh, we are not in business. We can't use ham radio for business. You can advertise, if you've got a piece of equipment that you want to sell, you're welcome to do that over ham radio. Unless, of course, you're the Derby Radio Shack and go, okay, today our specials can't do that. But you can go, hey, guys, I recently upgraded my radio, and so my old one's for sale. Yeah, you can do that. That's legal. You can't use ham radio for your employer. There's a couple of exceptions to that. One's listed here. Teachers can use them in their classrooms. They can be used to support emergency communications for people like emergency managers. But that's emergency communications. And there's some guidelines for that. If the phones are down and your employer comes up and says, hey, I've got this really important call that I need to get to so-and-so, can you do that via your ham radio? The answer is no.
Galen?
Yes, go ahead, Lee.
One of the things that comes up quite frequently for me is a lot of the guys in the club know that I'm a gunsmith. And so they'll contact me asking me about a problem or something like that. And it's legal for me to be able to help them with that. But at the same time, if I would say, well, I've got this special for cleaning this week at, $69.95. Or if I were to, do several other things like try to sell, gun parts or anything else, that's illegal. But if they contact me asking me a question, I can answer that question. And if it wants to go any further, then what I usually do is say, you need to give me a call on the phone and let's discuss it further.
Yep.
So you can discuss business per se, but very limited, and make sure that you never get into sales or anything else that's a really big no.
You can't do business over the radio. So, all right. Encryption, that means you're deliberately encoding the transmission somehow in order to hide or obscure the message. Can't do that, sorry. Back in the old days, we called that a scrambler. That was one way of doing it. You'd run your audio through some electronics and it would garble it up, and then you had to have the right decoder on the other end. Again, we do that in the public safety world, or we can do that in the public safety world, but you can't do it in the amateur radio world. And there's some things that are somewhat controversial in this, but those are probably beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. Some of the digital modes that use proprietary type stuff, there's some discussion about whether those are legal or not. But for the most part, if it's normal ham radio stuff, it's probably legal. And if it's out there or some homebrew stuff, yeah, we'll see. But again, you can't deliberately encrypt your messages. Again, you can't play DJ, nor can you play news anchor. One-way transmissions to the general public, nope, sorry. Again, don't play the news, don't play music. There are some exceptions. You can see those here. Morse code practice. Yes, you can do that. W1AW, the ARRL station, they have code every day, I believe. Ham radio related bulletins, you can do some of that. Some space stuff. But in general, you can't make one-way broadcasts. I, as an emergency manager, no, let me back up on how I said that. I, as a ham radio person, cannot get on the air and say, hey, everybody listening, there's, a tornado warning. Nope, that's illegal. That's a one-way transmission. Now, what I can do is I can call my friend KK5FM and go, hey, John, did you know there's a tornado warning? But as long as that's a two-way conversation, we can do it. One way, no go. There are special circumstances. We talked about that earlier. Emergencies, critical situations. There may be certain things that you can do. Just remember, when the disaster's over or when the emergency's over, the rules go back to normal. Okay, any questions so far? We've gone a little over 45 minutes. Do we need a break?
Nope, we're good.
We'll forge right on then, which will do good for me because my dinner I can smell out in the kitchen, and I'm in the other part of the house. So man, it's good stuff too. All right, so we're going to talk about safety. Completely different topic here than what we've been dealing with. You are entering a hobby that's lots and lots of fun, lots and lots of different things you can do with it. A lot of those can be dangerous if you don't pay attention to what you're doing. Because you're dealing with things that are electrical in nature. And when you do that, you can be susceptible to shocks and burns and low voltages and all sorts of other stuff. Pay attention to that. Let me show you something here if I can figure out where I put it a while ago. Thought I had it right here where I could get to it. And silly me, I've moved it, but we'll see if we can find it. I'm sorry, I'm on my other screen here. Let's see here if I can do this.
There we go.
We're good.
Can you see that?
Oh my!
Door.
Oh jeez, that's the cabinet door
Oh,
from power panel.
So this is a real photo taken by one of my co-workers about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. We have a backup power generator at our community center, and we had a vendor out doing regular maintenance on the generator, and he had done his work and decided to get into the box that houses the transfer switch. Little did he know that just inside the door of the transfer switch were all the main power cables, And you notice they're right up next to the door frame, and the latch for the door had been eating on this and eating on this and eating on this, completely unknowns to him. And when he touched the panel, apparently it was the last straw, and fire flew. The young man is still with us today. That's good. He did get a few burns on his hands. Fortunately, he had not grabbed onto the handle. He had, I think he was putting a sticker on the door. But just that movement caused the final thing. That's the, what you saw a second ago was the main power cable, which, as you can see, those are great big, and they carry lots of electricity. Very lucky young man. And there was no way for him to know that was going to happen. He's probably opened 1 million of those in his work, and this one, yeah, it almost got him. So
Wow.
just remember, electricity can do things, and bad things to you. Of course, the most effective way to practice your electrical safety is not to touch it to begin with. Keep your fingers out of things. Unplug things before you work on them.
What a concept.
Were you looking at me, Galen? Is that what you're doing?
No, actually, I was thinking about some radios I was working on today that, of course, the first thing I had to do was take the cover off of them, and they were plugged in. Of course, that's how you have to access them, and there's nothing out where you can get to them. So, but that made me think this morning while I had a radio open. But unplug stuff before you work on it. Remember that just by unplugging certain equipment, particularly older equipment that has capacitors in it, those store energy. So just unplugging them does not necessarily take the hazard away. Good practice is to keep one hand in your pocket. That means that you're not shorting you're not completing the circuit via you.
Mhm.
Make sure your equipment's grounded, use power from GFCI protected circuits. That's particularly if you're working in field day conditions or outdoor conditions, but works good inside too. If you do have to work on live equipment, take your jewelry off. That includes your rings. That includes your watch. Watch where you're putting your fingers. And the rest of you. You may be working in the middle of something and not realize that you're getting your elbow in things. Think there, maybe y'all have little children or been around little children at some point. So you know that they may be picking up something in the middle of their plate and their elbows in the jelly, right? Or in the peas and carrots that are on the other side of the plate. Same thing here. My first grade teacher wife apparently heard that because she kind of cackled a second ago. Yeah, watch what you're doing. That's the important part here. Watch what you're doing. Don't put body parts where they don't belong. Don't bypass safety interlocks. They're there for a reason. Make sure you discharge high voltage points and components safely. Discharge them to ground before you work on them. Again, be mindful of capacitors. Their job is to store energy. Storage batteries, same thing. When you short them out, yeah, bad things happen. If you do have some sort of issue, remove the power, turn the power off, unplug it. Make sure your switches and your circuit breakers are clearly marked. If you stick your finger in something, does your spouse, significant other, children, friends, whoever else is in there with you, do they know how to shut things off? That's why you mark them.
The water on you.
Good practice, install a master power switch and make sure that your again, make sure it's marked. Make sure your family knows where it is and how to use it. Obviously, call for help. And it's a good practice to know CPR and first aid. Enough said. Grounding, circuit protection. First of all, make sure that your wiring in your station meets code. Particularly if you go adding things. Make sure you're doing it properly. Make sure you have somebody that knows what they're doing, properly certified. Make sure everything you do meets code. Code is there for a reason. The reason is to ensure that you're safe. Most of the equipment that you will be dealing with, particularly as a technician, doesn't require a whole lot of special wiring or special circuits. Most of it is plug and play. I can assure you, even though I'm a general class amateur radio operator and have been around radios for a long time, and I do it at work some, I am not an electrician, and I'm not a wiring guy, and electricity scares me. I also, part of my job is ensuring that the tornado sirens for the city work properly. I've got one right now that's without power. It's been without power. Do I go out and open it up? Oh, heck no. That's somebody else's job. Back to special things. Most of the equipment that you're going to deal with, at least early on, doesn't require anything special. Having said that, if you wire something into a power supply, like a base station radio or mobile radio, make sure you don't short out the positive and negative on the power supply. That's how simple it is. Back to equipment, power cords. Most everything nowadays is 3-wire for a reason. That's your safety. Be sure and use circuit breakers, circuit breaker outlets, GFCIs. Make sure that your equipment is properly fused and that it has the proper fuse in it. Don't bypass your fuses. And make sure that the circuit breakers you're using and the fuses are of the proper size. Finally, don't overload your outlets or your circuits. I wish I had looked up the, some of you are old enough to know Green Acres, a TV show that was on, what, late 60s, early 70s probably, where they had a limited amount of power available, and the male lead had marked all the wires, and you can only have so much plugged in at a time, and the female lead went clear around that. But don't be outloading your outlets and circuits. I will tell you that professionals occasionally forget that rule. We recently went through an upgrade to the radio tower system that our public safety folks use. In fact, we converted it yesterday. By the way, Lee, it went very well. Lee and Mark. So just very few minor problems. But in the preparation for that, so understand at our tower, the system has 17 repeaters that are all interconnected, and they're all high power, repeaters. They use a lot of electricity to the point that the outlets that are at the top of the electronics racks are wired directly into the electrical system for the building. They all have their own circuit breakers and so on. As the technicians were preparing to install the new set of repeaters, they had to unbolt the old ones and move them a little bit so that they could install the new equipment. And in doing so, they found that their electrical wire wasn't long enough to the top of the rack, so they went and got some plain old power strips and plugged repeaters into those. Can you imagine? And there was 2 sets of these. So can you imagine the power load of 8 or 9 repeaters, or even 6, which would be the number of outlets in a normal power strip? I can assure you it's more than the 15 amp circuit that was circuit breaker that was in the power strip. We had radio issues that day. When they went to bring the tower back up, guess what happened? A bunch of the repeaters all of a sudden quit because they popped the circuit breaker. You'd have thought they would have understood that, but I don't know whether they got in a hurry or just was trying to use what was available to them at the time. But it caused issues down the road. Grounding and bonding. Understand that the things that can burn you and bite you in radio are not limited to the electricity. The RF, the radio energy that you're generating to go out your antenna, can also bite you. And if you have a lot of RF voltage, it can burn you. Typically with the equipment you will be using to start with and the power levels that you'll deal with, you generally don't get a lot of serious injuries from that, but it's possible. How many of you are familiar with the old KOMA AM radio station?
4 towers out on Indian Hills.
Nope, this was 3 towers just on the south side of 4th Street in Moore. KOMA was at one time was what they called a clear channel radio station. At night, they would switch all of their power and go directional in a northwest, southeast pattern, particularly northwest. And although their towers are here and more, I can assure you that as a kid growing up, we used to listen to that rock and roll radio station in Oklahoma City, in Kansas. My family and I were on vacation in northern New Mexico many years back, or several years back, and realized that OU had a basketball game that night. We're big OU basketball fans, and thought, well, let's try. Turned over to 1520 AM KOMA, and by golly, in northern New Mexico, we listened to OU basketball game. As I said, they're no longer around, by the way. The station's still there, but they're operating much limited power. They lost one of their 3 antennas during one of our tornadoes and chose to take one other one down. They're operating on 1 tower now, and not at the power level they used to. But The site was so hot that they had to do all sorts of grounding inside the building, which used to be right there with the towers, because there was so much RF that it would screw up all the rest of their stuff, like their microphones and their recording equipment where they made ads, and oh my gosh. And if you walked outside, you didn't want to touch the fence because it would bite you a little bit. But those are power levels far, far beyond what you'll deal with in ham radio. So you want to prevent some of that by making sure that you bond your equipment. That's how you connect it with heavy wire or strap. Again, solid core is better here. All of my radios that I've dealt with in the last couple of days during this conversion thing, I've got some base station radios, and my gosh, they've got a ground on them that's that big around, and it can't be physically weld bonded, but screw bonded, and the other end is what CAD welded. Here's the big deal, particularly if you're operating some sort of portable or mobile setup. You want to keep people away from your antennas and the wires on those when you're transmitting. This comes into play during field day, big time, because we're setting up portable antennas. They're typically close to the ground. We're not on top of a tower somewhere where the antenna's a long ways away from somebody. We need to make sure that we keep people away from our antennas and that they haven't reached over and, oh, what's this wire right as somebody keys up? Again, you want to not only RF ground them, you want to electrically ground them. Two different things here. Before we go farther, Mark Klein, do you have anything to add to that? Mark may have stepped away.
No, I just had the mute button on. No, I do not. I just remind that microwaves heat coffee, and we use radios that use similar frequencies. So that's the power of those kind of things. So be careful.
Be very careful. You're right. Yeah.
The question about pacemakers.
Yeah. Think about pacemakers.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
We in the radio hobby, we like to put pieces of metal way up high because they transmit better, depending on what we're doing. That makes them susceptible to lightning. So you want to make sure you ground your antennas properly. You want to, if you have a tower, you want to make sure it's grounded properly. Again, you want to use big, long ground rods, deep into the ground. You want to bond your tower legs. Your ground connections should be as short as you can get them. You want to use lightning arresters. Sometimes those are called polyphasers. That's a brand, but that's kind of a typical name for them. Use polyphasers, use lightning arresters. You don't want that electricity in your house, or what used to be your house. If you're expecting lightning, unplug. Make sure your antenna connections are off. Unplug it from the wall. Isolate that equipment. Don't forget your internet lines, your Cat6 cables. If you've got a phone line running to something, don't forget those. Those are susceptible too. Back to RF. As Mark said a minute ago, RF energy, depending on the frequency, will heat body tissues. We all know we don't stick our fingers in the microwave, right? Same thing. Again, how much it heats it depends on the intensity of the source to begin with and the frequency. Again, if you take the right precautions, your exposure should be minimal and not dangerous. I don't have one handy or within my reach. A lot of times questions are asked. Well, in fact, let me go grab one. I'll be right back. And here I am. So as a new ham or a technician, you're likely to start using handheld radios.
Mhm.
You've got RF coming out of that antenna right there, right? And if you're using the handheld properly, I don't know if this isn't going to show up. Hang on, let's see if I can do this. Anyway, can you even see me, by the way?
Yes.
Okay, just double checking here. I don't know if I can get rid of my background without messing things up here or not. Nope. Oh well, that's okay. We'll forge on anyway. If you're using this, you notice the antenna is about 2 inches from my nose and inside my electronics in my head. The power levels that you're radiating with a handheld are regulated by law to not cause severe issues with RF exposure to your body parts. One more reason you don't want to go messing around with equipment and jacking the power up on handhelds, because you might grow a third eye, or you might more likely have issues caused by those. We've had the same questions raised by some of our police officers and firefighters who, after 30 or 40 years of having an antenna either right next to them or even better yet now on their lapel, or next to their body down on their belt. But again, the power levels, the output levels, and the frequencies have been studied and regulated such that they are typically not dangerous to you. RF into the power, the frequency, and the distance from you. So again, if I'm radiating it on my HF rig, I have a 100-watt radio. The radio is right next to me. I'm touching it right now. You can't see it, but it's right here next to me. But where is that energy going? It's going through a line out to an antenna that's out in my backyard. It's up in the air, not as high as I would like it, but it's right now it's 30 feet in the air. So 100 watts, multiple feet up, multiple feet away. There's a building between me. My exposure is not that great. What if that antenna is on the ground or near the ground and I have my transmitter hooked up out there trying to adjust some things? Does that change the equation a little bit? Yeah, it does. Let's go back to the handheld. Okay, my power level, I'm about 2 inches. Do I have more exposure at 5 watts or 50 watts?
50.
Yeah, that's why these aren't allowed. These are 5 watts or less. Again, depending on your frequency. Again, your RF, the amount of RF that your body will absorb depends a lot on the size of the body part and what the body part is and the frequency that you're dealing with. And again, as I said earlier, safe exposure levels have been established by the FCC for your safety. This is showing the power density, how it changes by frequency. So we're talking about RF. And again, there's two different places that you may deal with this. First is a controlled environment. I'm sitting in my hobby room right now. I've got radios all around me. Again, none of them are on right now because I'm talking to you. But as I said earlier, you know, I know where my antennas are. Yes, I've got one right here, but I know what it does. I know that my antenna out back, there's nobody in my backyard. I don't have animals. So my RF exposure to the world is very controlled. And I can probably heighten my power a little bit if I so chose, because again, I know it's a controlled environment. There's nobody going to go in my backyard. Everything's high enough they can't touch. The RF level itself is not that great, and we're fine.
You mind if I make a comment?
Go right ahead.
I used to work in nuclear medicine, and we handled radioactivity all the time. And it's obviously not close to what, you know, it's a lot more than what you're dealing with here. But the main thing in dealing with that is just distance. And so if you're concerned about your handheld being too close to your face, use an external mic and just move it off. You know, even though it's low level and you're concerned about it, move it off, you know, 2 or 3 feet away from you, and you get a very small amount. And that's the same thing with higher power stuff. Just make sure your antennas are, if you're concerned about it, make sure they're as far away from people as possible, and you should be fine. So I know some people can be concerned about radiation of all different kinds, but the main thing is distance and the amount of time you're exposed to it. So that's my input.
Yeah. So again, it goes back to the power density. It's the amount of strength of your source, as you said, how close you are to it. And in our world, it's also depends on the frequency.
Yeah.
On how it's going to affect your body. By the way, if you are an OU basketball fan, I've just been handed a note that at halftime, our Sooners are leading the Golden Eagles of ORU 40-22 at the half. Yes, that is a one-way broadcast. I did not put that over the air. We talked about controlled environments, but sometimes you can't control your environment. You have no control of people near your antenna. If you're in that situation, lower your power. Try and keep people away. You adjust the exposure of your people. If you live in an apartment and you share a landing with the people next to you, and you have an external antenna mounted to the rail of your porch, can you always control who's around that? Something to think about. You know, some of your wires may start getting close to fences or your neighbors. Again, be mindful of that. You know, sometimes you can control your environment, sometimes you can't. Duty cycles. You know, we all have transmitters, or all will have transmitters. It's what we do. And the duty cycle is the amount of time that you're actually transmitting. So if I'm a ham radio operator and I carry my handy 2 meter rig with me, am I always talking Am I always radiating energy? No. You know, if I'm a good ham, number one, I'm listening first. And there's lots of dead air. So the duty cycle is the percentage of time that your transmitter is actually on. The higher your duty cycle, the higher average power density and exposure you have, because you're receiving more energy. That's just the simple way to put it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Your duty cycle will change some depending on the characteristic of what you're doing. Conversational sideband. Let me look here. Okay, Mark or Lee, you're going to have to help me with this. What is the difference in the first two? They both say conversational sideband. But you can see your duty cycle there is 20 to 40%. You move on, you're still on sideband, but you're doing frequency shift keying, you're doing slow scan TV. Your duty cycle goes from just talking, where you're pushing the microphone button, to when you push the button to transmit, you're transmitting constantly. You can see the difference in modulation on voice to AM. So depending on what you're doing, will change your duty cycle. That's the short version of this one. One of the things that you as a ham are required to do is a evaluation of your exposure to RF. Easiest way to do that is you can find online things. You can model it with software. You can measure your power density. The short version is take a look at what you have in your shack or wherever you're at and go, okay, what's going to get me? Again, I've got an HF rig to my right. I have an HF and a 2 meter, 70 centimeter to my left, and I've got my regular 2 meter there. How much exposure do I have? Well, fortunately, the antennas for all of those but one are outside. I have one inside antenna, but it is well away from me. It is at a level where somebody could touch it. However, I have just the normal things in the room are blocking people from doing that. So again, how much RF do you have? And by the way, when I use that mostly for receive, so there's zero exposure. But the limited times that I use it for transmit, I'm generally on a lower power because of what it is I'm doing. So do an evaluation of your RF exposure. Whoop, went too far. Lower power levels, you don't have to do one, varies with your frequency. If you don't have anything that transmits more than 50 watts at VHF, you're probably okay. Don't forget when you get a new toy, a new radio, or you change some of your setup, to go back and look at it again. Be mindful of what you're doing. You can reduce your exposure by relocating or reorienting your antennas. You can raise the antenna, that puts more distance between you and them again. You can reduce your gain, you can reduce your power output, change to a lower duty cycle. All of those should make fairly good sense. A lot of you will put installations in your cars. When you do so, make sure your equipment is secured. Don't be the guy that Velcro straps a 15-pound radio to the dash. Does that mean we've done that before? And even worse, 2 or 3 of those on the dash. Make sure it's all secured. That if you have to brake suddenly, it's not going to turn into a flying missile. You want to place your equipment where you can operate it safely while you're driving. If that involves looking at a display, you want to make sure the display is where it doesn't, it's just like a cell phone in that case. If you're having to look at a display and it's down here, let's see, yeah, you can see me. If it's down here, are your eyes on the road where they belong? Know the local rules. In Oklahoma, you are allowed, amateur radio operators are allowed to use your equipment while driving. Hands-free microphone's always a good idea anyway. It's not necessarily mandated in our state. If you go to a different state, you might want to check the rules. Back to antennas. As I said earlier when we were talking about lightning, we like to put things on tall poles because a lot of times height means better range. So we're not only susceptible to lightning, we're susceptible to getting things in power lines. Do you think your installation is going to fare well if it tangles up with the power line? Go back to the picture that I showed you earlier of the guy that got in the power in the transfer box. Anytime you're dealing with aerial stuff, you want to check for power lines. That includes if you're doing it up in a tree. Is there a power line that runs just above or around the tree? You can see some other rules here. You don't need me to read them to you. Goes back to common sense. Pay attention to what you're doing. Towers. I'm hopefully getting ready to install a new tower at my house. I hope I get it. You got to be smart. You need to wear your proper clothing, hard hats, eye protection, because particularly if you got somebody helping you that's on the ground. If I'm up at the tower, on top of the tower, and my wife's down below and I drop something, yeah, I don't want to be that person. When you go to climb, use a harness, a proper harness, not just a lineman's belt or rock climbing gear or something of that nature. Do it right. I'm sure I'm going to hear that out of my wife if and when I get my tower. If you have, some towers have apparatus on them that allow you to raise and lower them up and down, like a cable and a winch type thing. If you're going up that, make sure that you properly secure the tower first, not just by the cable. That cable's probably not rated, and the fittings probably aren't rated for an added 150, 200 pounds of your body weight. If you're going to try and lift heavy items, use a gin pole, a block and tackle type thing. Make sure you use a ground crew and make sure they have their hard hats on. Okay, RFI. I thought we already dealt with that, but we'll deal with a little more, I guess. Gosh, how much more have I got to go here? Yeah, we're about there. Okay. Radio frequency interference. Signals that interfere with your reception. Remember that that works both ways. Maybe you're the cause of the problem. Maybe you're the receiver of the problem. Might take a little detective work. Just as I talked about earlier with our public safety stuff, and it took some really smart engineers to figure that one out. Sometimes the offending signals get directly into your circuits. Sometimes they overload your circuits. If I were to have my handheld on and turn my radio on that's over here, and I'm on the same frequency, and my antenna's right over in the corner, and I decide to key down, it's going to blast this. It's going to overload that. RF current sometimes can be picked up by cables of regular consumer equipment. Used to be that people would complain about TVs and phones, and my ham radio operator guy next door, all I do is I hear him over my TV. Going back to KOMA and the days, I haven't told you, I used to be a dispatcher 400 years ago. And I can tell you that KOMA used to get into our antenna system for my backup police channel. And we'd listen, that's how we listened to KOMA while we were on duty. We'd turn up the backup channel and we'd listen to KOMA. There are stories of the people that live within a mile or two or three of there that they used to pick up KOMA on the fillings in their teeth, over their hair dryers, things that were plugged into the electrical circuits. Yeah, that was fun days. Mark, didn't some of your family used to live over that direction and would get to play with KOMA? I caught him napping again. Yes, that was the goal. Sometimes your issues are from harmonics of your frequency. Sometimes the problem, if you're transmitting on 145 megahertz, the problem's not always seen at 145 megahertz. Sometimes it's the harmonics of that signal. That's why we have filters, which reduce your signals, attenuate them. High pass and low pass and band pass, you can see those. Notch filters take out a small section of signals. And again, sometimes selecting the correct filter, you gotta know where your problem's coming from to start with. We could probably have put some filtering on our receiver on our backup police channel and reduced the issue with KOMA. I worked for cheapskates, they didn't do that. The truth is you probably couldn't have filtered that one. Sometimes you install chokes. You can see the information there. Probably one of the places you will see that is on your some of your cabling, your power cabling on your stuff. You'll run those through some ferrite beads to reduce some of the RF that's going around there. If you're causing issues with cable TV, again, that's probably some broken shielding on the cable. And normally you can get that fixed. Remember, lots of sources of noise, anything electrical, motors, so on, signs, fences, power lines, the list goes on and on. Remember, those might be sources of noise to you. Once again, operate your equipment properly. Good place to start with interference is at your own home. Make sure you're doing things that will reduce the noise in your own operation. And if you're reducing it in your home, you certainly are reducing it to your neighbors. Use shielded wire, shield your equipment, ground your equipment, use good connections and filters. If you have someone start complaining, a neighbor, take it seriously. Don't think they're just coming over to mess with you. And make sure that you're really not the cause before you start telling them you're not the cause. No, that can't be, that can't be. Oh, wait a minute, it is. Offer to help. You know, a lot of times you'll know a lot more about electronics than the people complaining. If you need, there are sources of help available to you. This one says consult ARRL resources. There's a wealth of knowledge within the club, including electronics people, electrician type people, operations people. There's just a wealth of knowledge available to you locally. Avail yourself of it. That's why we're here. We all love doing it. I say we. I'm not one of them. I would be one calling Mark or Lee or lots of other people. There are devices that are unlicensed. And those devices can't legally cause interference to you. An example of some of those devices might be our church recently purchased a very low power FM transmitter that they hang in the window of the church and pipe their service into that, which allows people to be out in the parking lot, socially distancing in their own vehicles and still able to attend church. That's an unlicensed device. You'll see the same thing if you go out to the Downs Family Christmas. I haven't been out there this year, but normally you go out there, as you drive in, it says tune your radio to 98.1 or whatever frequency they have, and you get to listen to the music that's going along with the dancing Christmas lights. Again, and there's lots of other things that are Part 15 unlicensed, but they're not allowed to interfere with licensed services. So if one of them starts interfering with one of my ham rigs, that's a licensed service. Works the other way around too. They're unlicensed. They have to accept interference from licensed services. As I said, the church I used to attend just bought a micro power FM transmitter. The first thing the pastor did was call me. It's a block away from where I work. He wanted to make sure, number one, that it wasn't going to interfere with any of our police and fire stuff. And then it was, you know, a little bit about radio. What else am I going to interfere with? This is the easiest thing. Bottom line, if you're doing what you're supposed to do, you're probably okay. Be a good neighbor. The people you're dealing with probably aren't familiar with rules and regulations. Again, you become the subject matter expert because you're a ham radio operator, and therefore you have knowledge that the average person doesn't necessarily have. We'll conclude the class this week talking a little bit about electrical safety, grounding, and circuit protection. Once again, you want to make sure that your home meets code and is up to code. Most of your equipment doesn't require special wiring or circuits. Make sure you use 3. We've all seen this before. Do things properly. That's the bottom line. If you're doing your electrical stuff properly, again, you're probably going to be okay. Use GFCIs, proper fuse sizes, use fuses, make sure all your equipment is fused, and don't overload your outlets or your power strips. Remember that grounding in the RF world is not the same as your necessarily your electric system grounding. You want to bond your stuff. Keep all of your equipment at the same RF voltage. You don't want current won't flow between pieces of equipment, which causes that. Minimize your hot spots. Use solid strap, not braided, or wire for your best RF connection. Hey, look at that. We're at the end. What questions do you have? I'm saying at least one head shake. Hopefully one head's not asleep. Anything? Go ahead.
You were talking about grounding your equipment. I mean, shielding your equipment. I may have missed that part, but what do you mean by that?
The most of the shielding that you're going to encounter is already built into the radios that you as a technician would use.
Okay.
The cables, a lot of times have, you can buy cables that have shielding on them. That actually was one of the things that our people did back in the KOMA days was we had to run all shielded cable on our end to keep KOMA out of us. I mean, it works the other way too. It knocks your signal down so that you're not necessarily causing the interference.
Okay, thanks.
Mark, Lee, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think the grounding and piece is once you get to HF is when that really kicks in, and that's something you'll learn as you go and building bigger antennas and stuff outside. But for starting, you're